Are Western human rights organizations truly independent to hold perpetrators of genocide and ethnic cleansing to account? And is international law now redundant after Iran and Gaza? These are the questions I asked Omar Shakir, who was the Israel Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, before he was forced to resign over a blocked report that he had commissioned that was critical of Israel.
This was clearly an unlawful war.
Chancellor Merz, who just the other day said that international law does not apply to Iran.
We saw, dozens of Iranian school children and teachers blown to pieces. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Western states rightfully invoked international law. You need to pick the rules-based international order that grew out of World War II or shielding an ally, Israel. And what we're seeing in Lebanon is the playbook of Gaza being repeated.
It would be very hard to argue that human rights law today can provide any form of justice for us.
An idea that there is a good Israel versus a bad Israel, and not acknowledging the original sin, genocide, ethnic cleansing, virtually everybody forcibly, displaced. The majority of Gaza turned to ruin. Concern about the repercussions Human Rights Watch might face if they were seen as challenging the Jewishness of the Israeli state. That's not the Human Rights Watch that I signed up for.
And so why do you think they blocked your report? Omar Shakir, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. Now, Omar, you were the Israel Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch until you resigned earlier this year. Your resignation was due to the Human Rights Watch leadership blocking a report accusing Israel of crimes against humanity. And I want to talk about that report and the implications of that. But actually, I'm going to start with a more fundamental question about international humanitarian law. Are we now entering an era where even a semblance of international humanitarian law is now redundant?
Look, I think we're very much entering an era in which the principles that grew out of the ashes of World War II are very much being challenged. In fact, in some ways, those very principles are being destroyed among the ruin of Gaza and now, in recent days and weeks, Lebanon and Iran. And for many of us in the human rights movement, we actually, as a part of our strategy after the October 7th attacks, went to countries in the West, in Europe, and basically had a strategy of saying, you need to pick the rules-based international order that grew out of World War II, or shielding an ally, Israel, from accountability for these attacks. And unfortunately, the reality is, if we look at the record, that for the most part, Israel's closest allies have shielded them, even if the rules-based international order was the collateral damage. And I think what we've seen since the beginning of the regional war is even to go a step further. This was clearly an unlawful war. There is no basis for it either under international law or under U.S. law. And what we're seeing in Lebanon is the playbook of Gaza being repeated. So in effect, we've seen the illegality in Palestine that's not just been taking place for a couple of years. It's been taking place for decades, and in fact, for more than a half century, now being transposed across the region. Again, it didn't start with the regional war. We saw it in Yemen, we saw it in Syria, we saw it in Lebanon, but now it's really going at a different scale, and it's not going to stop until states in the international community take concrete action. And there are action states can take to hold Israel and the United States accountable.
So I'm going to look at the role of really Western states when it comes to upholding this rules-based order. But at the time we're talking whilst the horror of the events are unfolding in Iran, a heinous attack on a sovereign state with no recourse to law, international or domestic. And worse still, only Spain amongst the European states have pushed back against the Trump administration and upheld this international order. I think it was Chancellor Merz who just the other day said that international law no longer does not apply to Iran. So almost evoking this idea that international law is for Western states or for purer states, and Iran is a lesser state. What does this really tell you about the current state of the liberal West, who have for a long time professed to uphold that Second World War order?
I mean, I think it shows you that unfortunately, despite increasing acceptance of the international legal framework, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have an international criminal court. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have as many mechanisms. We didn't have as many states that were sort of part of the human rights architecture. Despite that advancement, at the end of the day, these states have chosen their shielding an ally over the protection of international law. And I think you said it, exactly, correctly. When it comes to the regional war, ultimately, they committed the crime of aggression, the United States and Israel, right? That the Nuremberg trials talked about aggression as the supreme crime, a crime above all other crimes, because wars of aggression lead downhill to serious abuses of the laws of war. And in the case of Iran, we saw that in the first hours, where we saw, dozens of Iranian school children and teachers blown to pieces in a clear, apparent, war crime. And we've seen many other abuses take place recently in Lebanon, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, oil and gas and electricity. So, ultimately, this has been the skepticism of so many in the global south for so many years, that human rights and international law are a selective tool, that they're used when it's politically expedient to some countries and not when it's not expedient. Some states had a better record of having a consistency. But that's the very reason why, of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Western states rightfully invoked international law for the abuses committed by Putin's government and by Russia, but many states in the global south were skeptical. And indeed, their skepticism is proved accurate because many of the very same fundamental principles invoked in the Ukraine have not been invoked in the context of Palestine and now across the region. I mean, the context of Ukraine, you talked about people cited the right of self-defense of Ukrainians. People talked about the need for accountability and the International Criminal Court. People talked about sanctioning, Russian businesses. I mean, these very issues in some cases have become outlawed or sanctioned. I mean, look at U.S. law. They have issued sanctions against human rights groups calling for accountability at the International Criminal Court, the very same body that Western states supported in the context of Ukraine. When it comes to boycotts, Israeli law, bans entry to those who call for boycotts. And it's actually a civil claim that you can raise against somebody that calls for boycott. And in the United States, the majority of U.S. states have enacted legislation that punishes people who call for boycotts of Israel and entities. So again, you use the very same principles and compare it, and the record is clear. But I do want to say one more thing, which is, I think, really important to know, which is we have few other tools available to us. So all the skepticism we might say about international law, when you see dozens of school children blown to bits, international law is one of the very few tools we have that might provide some recourse, and we, as the weak that are trying to use international law as a tool for civilian protection for peace, we have to rely on that tool. We really have very little else to hang our hats on. So while it is a tool that's clearly, and again, the problem is not the tool, the problem is the lack of political will, but the answer really has to be in part the law. The law is not the answer for everything, but it has to be part of the answer.
Omar, can you tell me why you felt it necessary to resign from Human Rights Watch earlier this year?
I think in some ways it's linked to the conversation we're having. I mean, I served at Human Rights Watch for a decade. I'm incredibly proud of the work that we did. Our report finding that the Israeli government is committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Our work back in the day documenting the abuses in settlements and calling on FIFA and Airbnb, Booking.com, Israeli banks and the investors in those banks to end their complicity in Israel's war crimes. Our work since the genocide began, being one of the first organizations to, document the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and many, many other reports, arbitrary arrest and torture by the PA and Hamas. What kept me in the organization for so many years was the organization's fidelity to the way we do our work, which is very simple. We document facts, we collect the information, we publish that information, we apply the law, and we reach the legal conclusions that stem from the facts. And we've done that with integrity for the decade that I was in the role. And my colleagues around the world, that's the very methodology they use to make important contributions to advancing human rights across the globe. But that's not what occurred with this particular report, which was focused on the Palestinian right of return. In that case, and we can get into the details if you would like, quite simply, the report was approved through the entire Human Rights Watch system. It was coded to the website, translated, partners were briefed, and at the last minute, a new executive director pulled that report. Not because there was anything to cite in the law or in the facts. They post facto came up with arguments, each of which, are very easy to show weren't really the reality. This was about ultimately a couple of things, mainly concern about the repercussions Human Rights Watch might face if they were seen as challenging the Jewishness of the Israeli state, and a sense by some people in the senior leadership of the organization that the right of return was not the urgent priority of the moment, and that it shouldn't be what the organization does, particularly when issuing a report like this could lead to serious ramifications for the organizations. That's not the Human Rights Watch that I signed up for. It's not the organization I worked for a decade, and it's not the organization I could continue to work for. So I took the decision, along with my colleague in Jerusalem, our researcher there at the time, to resign from our positions.
We are here in Wajir County, Kenya, again with Beit al-Mal delegation. We are visiting this piece of land which Beit al-Mal acquired in order to build a state-of-art hospital. This land is 1.5 acres, and we have a business plan for that. Alhamdulillah, we have volunteer expert consultants in healthcare. The cost of the project is $700,000. But you can help with $100, $500, $1,000. All of this will help, inshallah.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
Prior to writing that report, when you first submitted a draft of that report, you live within the humanitarian architecture, within human rights architecture. You worked for a well-established international NGO. Did you find that even prior to submitting that report, you had to go through a level of self-censorship yourself in order to have an edit, in order to have a report that would be palatable maybe to that community? Like, was there a process of selecting the right words or holding back on some of your more stronger impressions in order to find that report to the public?
So I think yes and no, right? Because I'll start with the yes, in the sense that it's well known that Israel Palestine is subjected at Human Rights Watch, and Human Rights Watch is not unique. And in many ways, Human Rights Watch has gone much further than many other large humanitarian human rights organizations. It's subjected to extra scrutiny. That's a well-known fact. In fact, in his book, Kenneth Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch for nearly 3 decades, acknowledges the only country for which he reviewed every product for the vast majority of his tenure as executive director was the Israel-Palestine work. He individually reviewed every piece, a standard that wasn't used, for other countries. At the very same, and I should also add to it that because of the extra scrutiny, it meant that if you were making a finding or a conclusion or a methodology or an approach that was novel, you likely weren't going to get very far at Human Rights Watch if you were breaking ground on Israel-Palestine. Your best recourse was, of course, to cite established law and findings we've reached everywhere else. So even, for example, in the apartheid report, it helped us significantly that Human Rights Watch had found that the government of Myanmar was committing apartheid against the Rohingya in the Rakhine state. And in the case of this particular report, we had reached so the right of return is very well established under international law, and Human Rights Watch has called for it in context around the world and within the Middle East, in more than a dozen contexts around the world, and in Israel-Palestine. So the right of return itself, and Human Rights Watch has its own policy, its black letter law from human rights treatises, so that part was straightforward. What this report was doing was building on that by documenting how the denial of the right of return amounted to a crime against humanity. And in that case, again, Human Rights Watch had precedents. In 2023, in a report on the Chagos Islands, Human Rights Watch found that when the UK government had its policy of continuing to deny return to the Chagosian people to their homeland, they were largely removed fully removed, in fact, from their homeland in the 70s and the 80s, in part to build a U.S. military base in Diego Garcia, their continued denial of the right of return amounted to a crime against humanity. And again, Human Rights Watch based that conclusion also on the International Criminal Court in the context, again, of the Rohingya, but this time the Rohingya that were in Bangladesh, that their denial of the right of return to Myanmar amounted to a crime against humanity. So in this particular case, I didn't feel I needed to censor myself because this was a precedent that Human Rights Watch had published on. Palestinian refugees number in the millions. Their anguish is so well documented in Human Rights Watch publications, in scholarly work. And in addition to that, of course, we did the conventional Human Rights Watch methodology. We deployed teams across the region. We did dozens of interviews with Palestinian refugees in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, those that were displaced outside in Egypt, as well as generations of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in Syria, and Jordan. We visited refugee camps. We talked to experts. So we had followed the Human Rights Watch methodology. So when I submitted this report, it was straightforward. Now, the last part of your answer is to say, of course, there is a censorship in the sense of sticking to Human Rights Watch's mandate. Human Rights Watch's mandate is human rights law and humanitarian law. So a lot of times in activist circles, in other space, academic circles, there will be the use of academic terms or activist terms, but Human Rights Watch only uses legal terms. So for example, apartheid is a crime under the Rome Statute in its own convention. The crimes against humanity are an established crime. So we stick to what the crimes are. But so long as we're working in the realm of facts and law, there's no censorship, because if you're sticking to the law and you're documenting the facts, Human Rights Watch, and again, it was my experience for a decade, if you do the work and you publish it, it gets published. Something different happened with this report.
And so why do you think they blocked your report?
I think ultimately several things came together. There was a new Human Rights Watch leadership that came to power. And that leadership, and they were very clear about this, they were departing from the way the organization operated. Human Rights Watch, and again, for those who know the organization's work, really what makes Human Rights Watch unique is its vetting process, its review process. You can document facts, apply the law, draft a report. It spends at minimum days and often weeks and sometimes months and on some occasions years being vetted by dozens of people in the organization. And in this particular case, this report went through that entire process. It was vetted, it was signed off on by the Middle East Division, by the Refugee Rights Division, by the Women's Rights Division, the Children's Rights Division, because there was a piece of the report relevant to their mandate, the UN Advocacy, the Crisis Department, and then it went to the Legal Department. It also went to the Program Department, all of whom signed off on the report. I mean, you don't get reports that are coded to websites, translated, and partners briefed if you haven't done all of those steps. So this new leadership came in, and instead of doing what the organization has done, it did something really unprecedented in the organization's history, which is to shelve a vetted report. That was something that was unique, and I think it reflects, I'm afraid, and I hope it's not the case, a leadership that believes that they can use pragmatism as a way to, as they said, narrow the scope of findings. Or they can sort of decide, on their own that, this is not the priority at the moment. We're going to, the advocacy is too complicated. We're going to delay and push it back. Now, let me be clear. That's not how Human Rights Watch operated. When we did our report, which caused some controversy on the Al Ahli Hospital, a hospital in Gaza that was struck during the second week of the campaign in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, and Human Rights Watch did an investigation, and our tentative conclusions, which we published in late November of 2023, did not support the claim of many that it was a Israeli airstrike. We didn't reach a determination of who fired the strike, but the evidence we published pointed at being a rocket of the type generally used by armed Palestinian groups. Now, we published that conclusion, even though there was no advocacy strategy, even though it was in the middle of, there was a ceasefire during that week, a temporary ceasefire, but it was in the middle of, obviously, a campaign that resumed soon after. We did the same thing with our report that found Hamas carried out war crimes and crimes against humanity on October 7th. We did so because Human Rights Watch does that. We publish reports when they're vetted, no matter what their conclusions are, no matter what the advocacy climate was. I was the researcher that documented the mass killings of protesters in Egypt that led to Human Rights Watch's presence in Egypt in 2014 being shut down. I published the report on Israeli apartheid that had, of course, some effects on the organizations as well. And in each case, the report was vetted, it was finalized, it was published. It didn't happen in this particular case. And I think first and foremost, it reflects a new leadership. But there's another part of this, which is bigger than Human Rights Watch. And that part of it is I do believe in many ways, the right of return remains a sort of third rail among progressive or liberal Western institutions. You hear platitudes raised all the time by political figures about maintaining a Jewish state. And that's not really challenged, even though when somebody says we want to maintain a Jewish state, what they're essentially doing is asking to cement or lock in the gains of the ethnic cleansing that took place during the Nakba in 1948. But that's taken as sacrosanct. And at Human Rights Watch, and again, this is what colleagues told me, and that's part of why I knew this wasn't about law or facts. I had the senior colleagues that were cited as the ones having concerns that led to shelving the report, who told me in writing that their concern was about Human Rights Watch being seen as challenging the Jewishness of the state. And I think that's not unique to Human Rights Watch. I think that's a policy that's much broader. So even in some segments of pro-Israel communities, let's say, around the world, they may be willing to criticize the genocide in Gaza. Maybe they won't use that word. They might be willing to criticize the occupation. They may even be willing to say apartheid. They may be willing to say many things. But when you come to challenge the idea that Israel in 1948 was established through an ethnic cleansing, that in essence one people came to live on this land at the expense of the rights of another people, the fundamental rights of another people, that crosses a red line for people, for some people who have to maintain in their brain an idea that there is a good Israel versus a bad Israel, and not acknowledging the original sin, which was the ethnic cleansing of 1948.
Can I have your reflections on a speech given by Mark Carney a few weeks back? I think it was at the Munich Security Summit, where he argued that the rules-based order is now over. In effect, he said Trump had presaged an era that had ended that era. But he also said that it wasn't really, this rules-based order had never really been applied consistently anyway. And it was always hypocritical, I suppose, is the term we can use. I suppose from our perspective, we can look at the wars after 9/11 to enhance interrogation, CIA black sites, Obama's drone program. Liberals and Republicans were breaking international law without any recourse to any international form of justice. I suppose there'll be many Muslims, many Palestinians, many people who are pro-Palestine who would look at what's happened over Gaza and what is continuing to happen in the West Bank, but of course also now in Iran. And it will be very hard to argue that human rights law today is can provide any form of justice for us. But I infer from your words that it is still a tool we can use. Just square that for me. Explain why you feel that is still a recourse for us.
So I think you're absolutely right, and Carney was correct, that Trump has taken a wrecking ball to the rules-based international order. And even more than that, you can question the rules-based order to begin with. But I think we need to clarify an assumption here, right? The assumption that international law, the lack of enforcement of international law equates to the lack of international law. Enforcement is critical, right? Because without enforcement, laws don't have the same kind of meaning. At the same time, though, there does remain a global consensus around some of the ground rules that exist, whether they be the laws of war, whether they be the principles that underlie the body of international human rights law, the prohibition against torture, the prohibition against genocide. Now, people will deny whether or not they torture or commit genocide, but the prohibitions and those normative frameworks exist. And I think we need to take a step back and move outside the realm of law and have just a candid conversation. Ultimately, and I alluded to this earlier, we're talking about the powerful, and the powerful doing what they want to do. That has always been the case in world history, and that is certainly the case now. But when you say there is no rules, when you say it's an utter rule of the jungle, you deprive yourself of tools, which again are not perfect and are very limited and are not going to be, and we can talk more about this, they're not going to be the path to liberation. Liberation in any context around the world wasn't brought by a court case. I mean, you can look at U.S. history and look at the segregation in the South. There was court rulings, didn't change realities on the ground. There was laws that were passed, didn't change the realities on the ground, right? But at the end of the day, we're talking about a reality in which the strong have brute force. And that's what underlies the U.S. and Israel's projection of power in the region. Those of us that don't have that, we have fewer tools. So when we're talking about human rights law, who are the people pushing back, right? We're talking about human rights organizations, maybe an international criminal court, maybe some states that have a better record. Nobody has a perfect record. So we're talking about the weak. And so human rights and humanitarian law provides us with something. It's a tool that can at some point have some effect. And there are examples of where the law has had some effect. And more so, there are many examples where utter impunity has opened the door to worse and worse abuses. Ultimately, what I believe in any struggle on any issue around the world, you need a movement. You need people that are struggling using different forms of resistance. It may be artists. It could be authors. It could be journalists. It could be people with capital that are investing in supporting these. You need an entire architecture of in essence, resistance, right? Of using different forms of resistance, of different forms of pushback. And I think law has to be one of those tools. Lawyers should bring their tools. And by the way, human rights is not just the realm of lawyers. Others that are in the human rights movement should use those tools available to it without being naive enough to believe that if you do everything correctly by the book, you're ultimately going to succeed in changing the struggle. Law can be a tool. And, and I think Noura Arakat, she wrote a very powerful book about the Palestinian movement, and she described law as a sail. In essence, that it can be there as a reference, but you need, the currents and the wind to take it in particular directions. And in some cases, this links to what we're talking about at Human Rights Watch. I did everything by the book with this report, or it's not just me, it was a big team of us. It went all the way to the end. And in this particular case, leadership pulled rank and shelved the report. For me, I took the decision to resign, and I took the even maybe more controversial decision to speak publicly about the organization that I worked for a decade, that I care so deeply about, the people that I care so deeply about, because ultimately I felt it's critical. We owe it to victims of human rights abuses, including the people we interviewed, and to our partners in the fight to acknowledge that we got it wrong, but ultimately also there has to be an accountability for the organization, and there needs to be a course correction. And when they did not follow facts and law, it took me having to take a step that went outside of the normal process in terms of speaking out about it. And I hope ultimately it'll not only lead to the publishing of the report, but much more than bigger than Human Rights Watch, I hope it'll lead to a paradigm shift in how we view the right of return and in refugees.
But I do wonder sometimes, how much are you whistling against the wind here? You talk about the lack of enforcement, and surely with human rights law, at least historically, it was the will of the powerful states that upheld these laws, that allowed some semblance of justice for the weak. We've seen over the last decades, but in particular, we've seen after Gaza or during Gaza, and of course now in Iran, the so-called powerful states, Europe, America, they're unwilling to accept the most basic facts of the injustice that is taking place against these beleaguered people. They've turned a blind eye, in effect, to the atrocities that have taken place, and refused to even label these atrocities a genocide or crimes against humanity, or whatever term one can use. So I suppose my question is, enforcement does require powerful states to uphold these rights, and no amount of lawyers and public groundswell of public opinion is going to counterbalance the requirement for power here?
I think there are two things happening simultaneously, and I think we kind of have to look at it. We've covered a part of it in this conversation, but I kind of want to bring another side to it, which is, what does enforcement actually mean? Enforcement doesn't necessarily mean a court, giving us that beautiful moment of rendering a guilty verdict and putting Netanyahu or Trump behind bars. That's not always, in fact, that's usually not what justice looks like, outside of a few cases. But let's take the example of the genocide in Gaza. While we need to start with the scale of atrocity, right? I mean, genocide, ethnic cleansing, virtually everybody forcibly, displaced. The majority of Gaza turned to ruin. There were shifts that took place when it came to consequences for Israel that are in some ways unprecedented in the history of Israel Palestine. Let me give you many examples. The International Court of Justice has a case against Israel for genocide. They issued binding measures that are based on a presumption, that are based on a finding that the claims that were made were in some ways plausible. The International Court of Justice, in two separate advisory opinions, one of which said the occupation is illegal and recognized that Israel is committing apartheid against Palestinians. You have an international criminal court that issued arrest warrants for Israel's sitting prime minister. You had many states that cut or even or restricted arms to Israel. You had sanctions for really one of the first times issued against Israeli settlers and in some cases Israeli ministers. You had UN bodies that were, for example, adding Israel to its list of shame that the Secretary General, issues. You had UN bodies go further in special procedures. You had states and criticism and a consensus. States joined the genocide case. I could go on and on and on. This ledger of action did have some, I didn't even mention the economic side, where you had the EU review its trade agreement with Israel. And actually, that review found that Israel was not in compliance with it. You had some states, like even the UK, suspend its trade talks with the Israeli government. Now, let me be clear. None of this went far enough. It's nothing compared to the scale of atrocity in Gaza. It should have gone 100 or 1,000x further than it went. But to say that nothing shifted or that had no impact, I'll give you one example. Israel, for parts of 2025, from March until mid-May, had a full blockade on Gaza. Nothing went in, nothing went out. Why did it lift its blockade? One of the key drivers was when the EU decided to review its trade agreement with Israel. And you started to see action bubble up in the global north. And the ceasefire gave them an easy safety valve. It gave the appearance of action, and it blunted the very limited action. I don't want to oversell the action, but what I want to tell you is you have these two ships that are moving. One is the paradigm shift, is the global public opinion shifts, and the beginnings of some action being taken against Israel. And here I'm talking about Israel Palestine. On the other hand, you have Israel on the ground at breakneck pace, accelerating its project of ethnic cleansing and Jewish supremacy and mass killing and genocide in the case of Gaza. How these two ships interact will tell, in many cases, the future of Israel Palestine, right? The Israeli government is banking that they will move so quickly. And that's why they don't want to end this October 7th moment, right? For some, they see it as an opportunity. As much as the atrocities that took place, they see a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I'm talking about parts of the Israeli government, large parts of society, to change the map. And by the way, they have changed the map in really major ways that we can talk about. They know, and there's parts of the Israeli establishment that see the other side, that see these shifts and are saying, in the long run, this is counterproductive to Israel's future, no matter how you define that, right? Whether it's a future of occupation, genocide, or in some cases even going further than that. So how will these two things interact? So again, it goes back to what we said earlier. As movements, as activists, as lawyers, as people who care about international law and justice, we got to accelerate the pace of action, paradigm shift led by Palestinians, and try and stop this freight train of accelerating repression. But our option can't be to let that go. We should explore other means. We should be creative. We should think outside the box. But law is a small part, but part of that other ship that's moving a little bit too slowly. It stops. It in some cases takes on water, sinks. There's counteraction. But that ship is critical to the future of Israel Palestine.
Omar, you sound very optimistic or very optimistic about the use of this particular tool to hold those who need to be held to account, to hold them to some form of justice. I come across a lot of young people, in particular young Muslims, who are starting out. They've studied law at university, and they seek my advice. They normally come from far more pessimistic base, seeing what's happened over the last 2.5 years, and they want to know whether it is worth going into a humanitarian sector, whether that's from a legal perspective or whether that's from an NGO perspective. What advice would you give to such a person who's starting out in their careers?
So let me answer your question two ways. First of all, I don't think I'm saying something that's optimistic. I think in many ways I'm a realist about it. I'm talking about power, and I'm talking about the use of power and using the tools in our hands. We have to acknowledge, and I say we as people who care about human rights in the world, that we don't have power. We don't have sufficient power. You cited the example of Spain being the only country that spoke unequivocally about the U.S.-Israeli assault on Iran. So we have to use the tools at our disposal to shift power. So it's not optimistic, although I do think there are shifts happening. But I'm very clear also that those shifts are not at scale and they're not moving fast enough. And you could see this go many directions when I talk about Palestine. You could see the Israeli right, or in some cases now, the Israeli political establishment proved correct. They changed the map so dramatically that by the time we've changed the paradigm, it's taken its history. It's over. It's, look at the United States. Look at many other examples around the world. Or we could be successful in actually dismantling the apartheid regime. So there really are two fates, and it's really up to us. So I talk to people all the time. I feel in many cases a duty to speak to the younger generation of Muslims or the younger generation of people that care about human rights, about the fight. For me, what I'll say is we can't have all of us obviously doing human rights and humanitarian work. The movement's strength is its diversity, right? You need people at all levels. I firmly believe you need human rights lawyers, you need doctors, and we've seen the role of doctors in Gaza. They've been among the best witnesses to the genocide. You need people in the humanitarian sector because without support to communities under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, people don't have the Arabic term samud. They don't have the ability, the resilience to continue forward. You need people that are journalists, that are reporting the facts. You need people that are, really engaged in all sectors, including, by the way, people that are in the business world, in the corporate world, that are bringing resources because resources are power, and that are supporting these other initiatives, right? You also need people, and this is controversial in some quarters, in Muslim quarters, you need people in government because ultimately, shifts that can happen on the outside, you need people on the inside that are able to take the paradigm shifts and kind of, while we're trying to shift the paradigm, they're trying to slightly steer the ship in different directions. But the key point of it is, folks need to, one, if they want to commit to this, they need to see where their passion is. And if this is your passion, to me, it becomes a project of where can you contribute best, right? Are you going to be an effective human rights lawyer? Go do that. Are you going to be a more effective doctor that can bear witness and provide services? Are you going to be a more effective person in the corporate world that's going to rise and get to a position of power or accumulate resources, but then invest those resources in supporting the people that are changing the pendulum? So I think we so often think, young people ask me, what's the most impactful thing? I don't think there is one single most impactful thing. It depends on what your issue is. It depends on the moment you're in. It depends on your own vantage point and perspective. And everyone's going to have their own personal circumstances, where they live, what their nationality is, what their skill set is. But the question they need to be asking really is, what is your skill set? And where are you best positioned, given who you are, to contribute to the cause? And if you make those your guiding questions and follow that, so you have to develop the passion. That's step one. You have to know what you're passionate about. And you might have a commitment to universal human rights, and hopefully everybody does. But it might be that what speaks to you most is women's rights or immigration or Kashmir or Palestine or Syria. all of that's legitimate because the community needs actually, really all of these fronts. But figure out what speaks to you and then figure out your positionality, your skill set, your strength, and go on a journey through your education and then through your early career to hone in on where you can make the most impact. My own life story is a journey of figuring that out, and that's a journey that should continue throughout your life.
So, Omar, I understand that you've now moved to become the executive director of Dawn MENA. And Dawn is an organization that was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, who tragically was killed by the Saudis in a Turkish in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Tell me a little bit about this organization and what you hope to achieve through it.
So Dawn isn't just linked to Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi is the founder of Dawn. He created Dawn back in 2018 to advance a vision of human rights, democracy in the Arab world, and even more broadly than that. Unfortunately, he was killed, by the Saudi government, and he wasn't able to bring that organization to realize that vision. However, the organization was established in 2020, and for the last 5 years has done really incredible work pushing the envelope in the fight against impunity. So Dawn's work looks across the region, and they've made really incredible inroads, including fighting for justice for Jamal's death. But when we look at the context of what we've talked about in Israel Palestine, Dawn actually brought charges against Biden and senior Biden administration officials for complicity in Israel's genocide and other atrocities at the International Criminal Court. They were the one voice to do that. Dawn has also doggedly put together dossiers on perpetrators across the region in the context of Israel Palestine, settlers and other mid-level Israeli government officials that are involved in abuses. And they haven't just left those dossiers on the shelf. They've actually used those dossiers to push for sanctions and have gotten sanctions issued in many cases. They've also have a lawsuit in progress now, which is challenging the U.S. government for not implementing Leahy laws. These are laws that ban funding to abusive armies. And of course, it's never been really applied to the Israeli government. They have a lawsuit that survived initial challenges, really unprecedented, that is challenging the fact that the U.S. keeps giving arms to Israel despite this law that's in place. Dawn has also launched a campaign against AIPAC, identifying who are the leading figures in this Israeli lobby organization that operate behind the scenes and have been so instrumental in cementing the U.S. support for Israeli hegemony and apartheid on the ground. In addition, Dawn is pushing the envelope when it comes to New York State's investment in Israel bonds. At the same time, Dawn has this network of fellows across the region that are advocates for human rights and democracy across the region that are publishing and writing. So when I look at Dawn, to me, it really fits the moment that we need. Right now, and it links to our conversation, we've talked extensively about how atrocities have been documented. The information is out there in the public domain. For me, what this moment needs is accountability and an end to complicity. And Dawn is really well positioned as an organization that is built on the legacy of Jamal Khashoggi and that is pushing the envelope in the fight for impunity to take this a step forward. What's needed at this time is going after perpetrators that commit abuses, that's taking research and building on it with research operationalized for impact, whether it be sanctions, whether it be prosecutions, whether it be, sort of going after companies that are complicit in these abuses, but doing so with a region-wide perspective because we're seeing the linkages that happen between the region, right? I mean, and again, you can look at the history of the Arab world. The Arab Spring sort of reflected a sense from some Arab activists. And again, you could even go before the Arab Spring of 2011. In many cases, the impetus for the Arab Spring grew out of the Second Intifada. If you look at protests in Egypt and across the region, and a sense of, wait, some of our governments are complicit in the suffering of Palestinians. Let's change our government, and then we can work on broader liberation in the region, including Palestine. That calculus shifted amid the genocide in Gaza. So more than a decade later, you're seeing Arab activists that understand that, wait a minute, the project of Jewish supremacy in Israel, the project of Israeli and American hegemony in the region is part of what's keeping these repressive governments in place in many parts of the region. So there is this linkage, and Don is really well placed, I think, to make those connections, to really be at the front of the struggle for human rights in the region. And I'm really excited to take this organization forward. And I do think, in conjunction with partners and in conjunction with other movements, there is really space to move the envelope, as dark as the world seems. And really, this war in Iran has emphasized Don's unique voice. Don was there early Saturday when the war began, calling this what it was, an illegal war, a war of aggression. They were a unique voice on that. They followed that up, 48 hours later. We followed that up 48 hours later with a call on the UN General Assembly to convene, for states to convene that body to call for an end to hostilities. We also called on U.S. Congress to convene under the War Powers Act and make clear they don't sanction this war, which they never sanctioned from the beginning. And later, the first week of the war, Don came out and said that Iran should file a declaration to give the International Criminal Court jurisdiction over crimes like the attack on the school in Minab. Again, we made the same call for other states in the region. We also called for them to preserve and secure evidence and to engage with UN fact finders and human rights mechanisms. That call was unique because we're seeing more and more evidence of war crimes, but not enough calls for accountability and justice. And that's really where I think Don's value add is.
Omar, my final question is really about where conscientious, justice-minded people go to now for alternative forms of or sources of justice. We can see there is a groundswell of opinion around the world now that sees Western hegemony for what it is. They see their sort of Israeli Zionist state as being a state that's out of control and that has voracious ambitions upon the region. And they don't like it. And, there is now a plurality, if not a majority of people, Muslims and non-Muslims in Western countries that are incensed by the way by which their governments maintain the status quo and do not question that injustice that's taking place. Now, you and I are Muslims, and we believe in a form of consistency in that humanitarian space. That's the best of our Islam. I think the best periods of Islam were times where we were known for our righteousness and our chivalry when it comes to engagement with others, engagement with other nations and other states. How far do you believe we can? How far do you believe there is a will, I suppose, to reconstruct this type of ethical framework that comes from our religious sources in this world that is really falling apart?
I think it's a great question. My own faith is a key part of my own, moral compass and the work I do in human rights. And I think among the parts of the Islamic tradition is this idea that one of the greatest, forms of justice is to speak out about oppression, even when it's your own that's committing the abuses. And I think that's always been a guiding compass of my work, whether it was, covering abuses by the Egyptian government, the mass killings of protesters after the coup of 2013, or for me as an American, representing men detained in Guantanamo Bay that were being detained in the name of the U.S. government. And I think these values exist. I think people are starting to understand that. I think in some Muslim communities, there's often a defensiveness, when there's criticism of governments or our own practices, right? Our records when it comes to, in many parts of the world, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to many other issues. But our strength has to be consistency. You can't cite a principle in Palestine or an organization's work in Palestine, but then when it's making the same claim about Iran's abuses or about, another government you may support, the Syrian government, whatever government you may support's abuses, Sudan, have a different standard. There has to be a moral consistency to your premise. And by the way, again, I keep linking it. It's linked to the Human Rights Watch situation. I felt that if I'm going to be a human rights activist that documents people jailed for their free expression, free association, I have to have the moral consistency to speak out when my own organization does something that I believe isn't in keeping with its values. But I mean, just to get back to your question, I think that ethos is there, and I think it's growing. As you said, we can't take for granted the shift in public opinion, the fact that there are large majorities in many parts of the world. I mean, even now in the U.S. and among the, let's say the Democratic Party, and there's shifts even within the Republican Party. So where do we take that? I think the answer, and it links back to what we said earlier, there is no universal answer. If there was one magic button that we could all press, we would have put all our energies and all our eggs in that basket. But we really can't do that. I think ultimately for all of us and for your listeners, it's about localizing this. No matter where you are in the world, there are things you can do in your own communities to start with, right? Look at your own university, your own local government, your own church, your own synagogue, your own mosque. Its investments. Look at its own institutional connections. Look at your own government and through its representatives and what policies it's engaging in. Again, I'm not just talking about those of us that live in the West. I'm also talking about those that live in the Muslim world, because in this day and age, there are counter balances of power. For example, we just saw very recently the Hague Group convene in Netherlands in recent days. Now, for those that don't know, the Hague Group is this conglomeration of states in the global south largely that are coming together to defend international law, to defend the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and and to also call for sanctions and other kinds of actions that are warranted based on the Israeli government's actions. Now, you can look at those. There are many, in fact, Arab Muslim governments, not all of them. Those governments can go further. There are many governments in the region committing abuses against their own people, but also ensuring U.S. or Israeli impunity for their crimes. So everybody can do something. I think the best thing you can do is to localize it, because that's always the most impactful. So start in your own household, start in your own institution, move to your local representative, and then go larger. Action movements that are rooted in, and it can be in your own professional association. These are all really, really significant. And the more these voices collect, the more they will lead to change. Now, it's not inevitable. History can go a lot of directions, right? But the more that we do, and then there's also a need for those of us that are on the front lines of the fight to coordinate better, to organize better, to be more strategic. In the Muslim community, we have this problem, right? That when Palestine's on fire, when when there's a flood, we jump to our checkbooks, we jump into action, we act with our hearts. But when it's not in the news, when there are ceasefires, between quotes, when there is less attention, we're not investing in those institutions. We're not building strong, viable institutions that can safeguard and can be strategic in their work. So we also need to we need to be strategic. And I'm starting to see this, by the way, in many different communities that people are starting to think ahead about how do we build stronger institutions that can be strategic and that can work not just in the moment which is critical, to give people food, to get them shelter, right? But how can we think about larger term shifts? We need all of it. The bottom line is we can't afford the luxury, and this links to where we started the conversation. We cannot afford the luxury of giving up, The people who live on the ground, start with Palestinians in Gaza, they're not giving up. They're waking up every day and trying to find water and find food. So none of us have the luxury of giving up. We just have to find where we can plug in, where we can support, where we can amplify, and do that, because ultimately it's really important. Things are shifting, not fast enough, and we need to act more and do more to change things.
Omar Shakir, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your